Initiative Psychic Energy by Warren Hilton. Chapter 1. Mental Second Wind. Are you an unusually persevering and persistent person? Or like most of us, do you sometimes find it difficult to stick to the job until it is done? What is your usual experience in this respect? Is it not this, that you work steadily along until all of a sudden you become conscious of a feeling of weariness, crying enough for the time being, and then you yield to the impulse to stop? Assuming that this is what generally happens, does this feeling of fatigue, this impulse to rest, mean that your mental energy is exhausted? Suppose that by a determined effort of the will you force your lagging brain to take up the thread of work. There will invariably come a new supply of energy, a second wind, enabling you to forge ahead with a freshness and vigor that is surprising after the previous lassitude. Nor is this all. The same process may be repeated a second time and a third time, each new effort of the will being followed by a renewal of energy. Many a man will tell you that he does his best work in the wee watches of the morning, after tedious hours of persevering but fruitless effort. Instead of being exhausted by its long hours of persistent endeavor, the mind seems now to rise to the acme of its power, to achieve its supreme accomplishments. Difficulties melt into thin air, profound problems find easy solution. Flights of genius manifest themselves. Yet long before midnight, such a one had perhaps felt himself yield to fatigue and had tied a wet towel around his head, or had taken stimulants to keep himself awake. The existence of this reserve supply of energy is manifested in physical as well as mental effort. Men who work with their heads and men who work with their hands, scholars and marathon runners, must alike testify to the existence of reserve supplies of power not ordinarily drawn upon. If we do not always or habitually utilize this reserve power, it is simply because we have accustomed ourselves to yield at once to the first strong feeling of fatigue. Evidence of this same fact appears in our feelings on different days. How often does a man get up from his breakfast table after a long night's rest, when he should be feeling fresh and invigorated, and say to himself, "I don't feel like working today," and it may take him until afternoon to get his work-a-day stride, if indeed he reaches it at all. You cannot yourself be immune from the feeling on certain days that you are not your best. Somehow or other your wits seem befogged. You hesitate to undertake important interviews, your interest lags, and though crises arise in your business, you feel weighted down and unable to meet them with that shrewd discernment and decisiveness of action of which you know yourself capable. But you realize in your inmost self that if you continue to exert the will and persistently hold yourself to the business in hand, sooner or later you will warm to the work, enthusiasm will come, the clouds will be dispelled, the husks will fly. Yet you have had no rest. On the contrary, you have, by continued conscious effort, consumed more and more of your vital energy. Obviously, it was not rest that you needed. What you required was the impulse of some strong desire that should carry you over the threshold of that first inertia into the wide field of reserve energy so rarely called upon and so rich in power. Under the lashings of necessity, or the spur of love or ambition, men accomplish feats of mental and physical endurance of which they would have supposed themselves incapable. Here is what a certain lawyer says of his early struggles. When I was 23 years old, married and with a family to support, I entered the law course of a great university. Of the many students in my class, 7, including me, were making a living while studying law. By special arrangement, I was relieved from attendance at lectures and simply required to pass examinations on the various subjects, and was thus enabled to retain my place as principal of a large public school. During the third and last year of my law course, I was principal of a public school of 2,000 children and an alternate night school with an enrollment of 750, and I worked at the law 3 nights in the week and all day Sunday. After 8 months of this, the final examinations came around. They consumed a full week, from 9 in the morning until 5 or 6 at night. I had no opportunity for review, so I rented a room near the law school to save the time going and coming, and reviewed each night the subjects of examination for the following day. I did not sleep more than 2 hours any night in that week. On Thursday, while bolting a bit of a luncheon, a fishbone stuck in my throat. Fearful of losing the result of my year's effort, I returned to my work, suffering much pain, and kept at it until Saturday night, when the examinations were concluded. The next day, the surgeon who removed the fishbone said there was no reason why I should have not had a bad case of gangrene. When I look back on that year's work, I don't see how I stood it. I don't see how I kept myself at it, day in, day out, month after month, without rest, recreation, or relief. I am sure I could never go through it again, even if I had the courage to undertake it. I ranked second in a class of 180 in my logs of Initiative Psychic Hilton. This is all LibriVox domain. Or to volunteer, LibriVox.org. By Andrea F. Initiative Psychic Energy, Chapter 1. Second Wind. Really persevering or like most of us, find it difficult to stick to. What is in this respect? That you work steadily along and you become conscious of crying enough, and then you yield to the impulse, assuming that this is what. Does this feeling of fatigue to rest mean that you're exhausted? Some effort of the will you to take up the thread of work. Invariably come a new supply, second wind, and with a freshness rising after the previous. Nor is this all. He repeated a second time. Each new effort of the renewal of energy tell you that he does his best watches of the morning, persevering, but fruit. Instead of being exhausted, a persistent endeavor now to rise to the act to achieve its supreme. Difficulties melt into thin problems, find easy solutions. Of genius manifest, yet long before midnight, perhaps felt himself and had tied a wet towel or had taken stimulants to keep. The existence of this is manifested in mental effort. Men who work with their hands, marathon runners, to the existence of power, not ordinarily. If we do not always or preserve power, accustomed ourselves, first strong feeling of fatigue. This same fact appears in days. How often breakfast table, after, when he should be feeling, and say to himself, like working today, till afternoon to get his. If indeed he cannot yourself be immune days that you are somehow or other you hesitate to use your interest, and though crises arise and you feel weighted down, and with that shrewd discerned action of which but you realize that if you continue to persistently hold yourself, sooner or later enthusiasm will be dispelled. Yet you have had no contrary. You have conscious effort consumed vital energy, rest that you needed. It's the impulse of some strong to carry you over the threshold into the wide field so rarely called a power. Under the lash or the spur of love and accomplished feats of mental of which they would have support. Here is one of his early struggles. 23 years old to support. I at a great university. In my class, were making a living by special arrangements at lectures, examinations on the and was thus enabled to as principal of a large. During the third and last, I was principal of a public children and an with an enrollment of 7, and I worked at the law all day Sunday. The final examination, they consumed a full morning until 5 or 6. No opportunity for a room near the law school coming, and reviewed each nation for the following. Sleep more than 2 hours. On Thursday, a fishbone. Fearful of losing the, I returned to my work pain and kept at it when the examinations were. Next day, the surgeon who said there was no reason why I should have a bad case of gangrene. On that year's work, I don't see at it. Day in, day month, without rest. I am sure then, even if I had, I ranked 180 in my, won the second prize thesis, received for class oratorship. The prize was soon at superintendency by the school board studies and thought my work promotion. This year's work, but the best it exemplifies that the more we can do and the better. The following is an excerpt by Professor James Baird Smith after 1857 to contributed. Had some reason to think between Chapter 2 of Initiative Psychic Energy. Chapter 2 Reserves of Power. Stored up energy not in use has been given a name by scientific men. They call it potential energy. In this way it is distinguished from kinetic or circulating energy, by which is meant energy that is at work. For example, a ton of coal in the bin contains a certain amount of potential energy, which is capable of being converted into kinetic energy by combustion. You have a vast amount of potential energy over and above what you actually use. You have formed the habit of giving up trying a thing as soon as you have spent the usual amount of effort on it, and this without regard to whether or not you have accomplished anything. While we all have the power of sustained mental activity, not 1 in 10,000 of us holds to the top pace. Worse still, even such mental energy as we do consume is dispersed and scattered over a multitude of trivial interests instead of being focused upon some one pursuing aim. We intend to show you how you can lose yourself in your work with an absorbing passion, and how you can at any time make special requisition upon your hidden stores of potential energy and draw new supplies of power that will sweep you on to your goal. More than anything else, it is the ability to do this that lifts the great men of the race above the common run of mortals. It is this that distinguishes genius from mediocrity. The master man transforms his vast stores of reserve or potential energy into circulating or kinetic energy. His work glows with living fire. Yet for every such man there are a multitude of others, equally gifted in some respect, but wanting that mysterious open sesame which would discover their hidden mental riches, arouse them from their accustomed inferiority to their best selves, and transform potentiality into accomplishment. So it comes about that most of us are gems that shine but to illuminate the dark unfathomed caves of ocean, flowers born to blush unseen. Take an illustration of the way in which this reserve or potential energy is transformed into circulating or kinetic energy. Suppose that you are a countryman and come to live in a large city. The speed with which we do things, our habits of quick decision, the whirlwind of activities of the busy man in town appall you. You cannot see how we live through it. A day in the business district fills you with terror. The tumult and danger make it seem like a permanent earthquake. But settle down to work here, and in a year you will have caught the pulse beat. You will vibrate to the city's rhythm, and if only you make good in your work, you will enjoy the strain and hurry. You will keep pace with the best of us, and you will get more out of yourself in a day in the city than you ever did in a week on the farm. This change in degree of mental activity does not necessarily mean that you are making more of a success of life. Your activities may be ill-directed, your newfound powers may be misspent and dissipated. But you are mentally more alert, your mental forces have been stimulated by the stirring environment. And mark this particularly. A number of mental pictures will pass across the screen of your consciousness today in the same time that one mental image formerly required. Now you have learned that with every idea catalogued in memory, there is wrapped up and stowed away an associated feeling tone and an associated impulse to some particular muscular action. Assuming this, you must at once see that here is an explanation of your newfound energy. Your quickened step, your newfound decisiveness of action, your more observant eye, your clear-cut speech instead of the former drawling utterance, your livelier manner, your freshened enthusiasm and enjoyment of life, all of these are but manifestations of a quickened intelligence. They are the working out through the motor paths of mental impulses to muscular action. And these impulses to muscular action come thronging into consciousness because the livelier environment brings about a more rapid reproduction of memory pictures. And here comes a particularly striking fact. One would naturally suppose that the more energy a man consumed and the faster he lived, the more quickly his vitality would be exhausted and the shorter his life would be. As a matter of fact, by the divine beneficence of Providence, your organism is so ordered as to adapt itself within certain wide limits to the demands made upon it. You may call into play all the stored up resources of your being and still not stake everything upon a single throw, for the supply of mental energy is as inexhaustible as the reservoir of all past experience, while the supply of physical energy involved in brain and nerve activity is, like the immortal liver of Prometheus, renewed as fast as depleted. Two sets of facts that have been established by elaborate scientific experiment will convince you of the truth of these propositions. Professor Patrick of the State University of Iowa conducted some of these experiments. He caused 3 young men to remain awake for 4 successive days and nights. They were then allowed to go to sleep, the purpose of the experiment being to determine just how much time nature required to recuperate from the long vigil. They were allowed to sleep themselves out, and all woke up thoroughly rested, yet the one who slept the longest slept only 1/3 longer than his customary night's sleep. You have doubtless had the same experience yourself many times. It all goes to show that if we are awake 4 times as long as usual, we do not make up for it by sleeping 4 times as long, but 4 times as soundly as customary. The hard-working mechanic requires no more hours of sleep than the corner loafer, the active man of affairs no more than the dawdler. The time of tissue repair is about the same with all men under all conditions. It is the rate of repair that varies with the demand that has been put upon the body. Again, look at the same subject from the standpoint of food supply. On what you now eat and drink you have a certain average weight. Eat, digest, and assimilate a larger quantity of food, and your weight will increase. This increase will be greatest at the start, and will gradually slow up until you shall have reached the point beyond which you can gain no more. Given the same hygienic conditions that you have been accustomed to, you will maintain yourself at the increased weight on the increased food supply. Now all this involves clearly enough a greatly increased rate of activity on the part of bodily organs of assimilation and repair. It is a situation on all fours with that of the countryman whose rate of brain activity has been stimulated by an increased mental demand. No man will maintain that better, more nourishing, and more liberal food rations, transformed into increased bodily tissue, with a consequent greater weight and greater muscle strength, would result in a loss of vitality or the shortening of a man's life. Pygmies cannot become giants physically or intellectually, but as the puny youth can by systematic exercise broaden his frame and develop his muscle into at least a semblance of an athlete, and can then go through his healthier appetite and his faster rate of repair maintain himself without effort at the new standard, so can the mentally inert call forth their reserves of energy and maintain a higher standard of activity and fruitfulness. Few men live on the plane of their highest efficiency. Few search the recesses of the well springs of power. The lives of most of us are passed among the shallows of the mind, without thought of the possibilities that lurk within the deeper pools. This accumulation of potential subconscious reserve energy is a result of the evolution of man and the growing complexity of his life. No man could, if he would, respond to all the impulses to muscular action aroused in him by sense impressions. It would be still less possible for him to respond to every impulse to muscular action awakened from the past, with the remembered thought with which it is associated. Desire, interest, attention, and the selective will must pick and choose among these multitudinous tendencies to action. Here, then, is another fact